being the pastor's daughter was never a choice. It was an identity given to me before I even learned to say my own name. I grew up with responsibility tailored to my shoulders like a custom-made dress, invisible to those looking from the outside, but too tight for the one wearing it every day. My smile was the first thing noticed at Sunday services, my words the most careful, my presence expected at every meeting, visit, baptism, and assembly. And I carried it with serenity, or at least that's what everyone saw. But inside, sometimes, what I felt was closer to silence than to faith, a kind of silence that even the most beautiful hymns couldn't fill. Everything began to change when small things started to feel out of place. First there were flowers, left at the gate, then letters with no sender, too many questions from faces I barely knew. My father, always protective, always calm, tried not to alarm anyone. But I noticed when he started closing the windows earlier, when his eyes began to follow my steps, even as he let me walk alone. And then he arrived. Not as an angel nor as a knight, but as a presence, steady, silent, utterly detached from the social world surrounding me. They said only that he had been assigned to ensure my safety for a while. Nothing more, no explanation. And maybe that's why he unsettled me so much, because he was different from every man I knew. He didn't smile to please. He didn't ask trivial questions. He didn't recite verses to impress me. He just watched me. With a kind of attention I didn't know how to interpret. There was no desire in his gaze. But there was something even more dangerous. Truth. It was as if he saw beyond the pastor's daughter. As if, in his silence, he heard things I had never dared say aloud. And that, at first, unsettled me. Because I didn't know how to be seen like that. And still be who I had always been. First I tried to ignore him. I kept to my routine as if he were just another shadow among the familiar walls. I didn't speak to him unless necessary, didn't ask anything beyond what politeness required. But there was something in the way he moved, calm, calculated, attentive without being intrusive, that began to occupy space in my thoughts. He knew the exact moment to appear and the precise instant to vanish. He never raised his voice, never offered opinions, but he was always there. And over time, I realized his presence didn't bother me. It calmed me. When I spoke with someone, even from a distance, I knew he was watching. When I entered the church in the morning, he was already in the corner, as if he had slept there. And as the days passed, I began to notice things no one else saw. The way he brushed his fingers against the doorframe before crossing the threshold, as if measuring the space. The way his gaze lingered for milliseconds on details, my hands, my necklace, the books I carried. It wasn't desire, it was attention. And that attention, for reasons I didn't yet understand, made me feel seen. For the first time I felt I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to smile out of obligation or respond sweetly to meaningless remarks. With him there, I could simply exist. And that scared me more than any external threat. Because the more I allowed myself to observe this silent man, the more I realized there was something in him that mirrored something in me. A similar loneliness, a familiar restraint, as if we were two kinds of prisoners. Me, of expectation, him, of duty. And it was in that realization that everything began to change. Not on the outside, but within me. Because for the first time, I wanted to know someone, not as the pastor's daughter, but as a woman. I can't say exactly what made me go out that night. Maybe the restlessness that had been growing inside me like a rope tightening slowly. Maybe it was just the desire to breathe away from the weight of my name, the approving glances, the walls of the parsonage where everything echoed expectation. It was late. I just wanted to walk, to think, or maybe to tire myself enough to sleep. The town was empty, and I believed no one would notice, but he did. I don't know how he found me. I only know that at a certain point, I realized I wasn't alone. I felt his presence first, before I even heard him. And when I turned, there he was. Broad shoulders, steady posture, eyes darker than the sky that night. I was about to justify myself, to say I just needed a moment alone, but he didn't. "Give me time." He said only, "It's not safe." And in the tone of those words, there was something more than professional concern. There was tension, restrained anger, fear. I tried to challenge him, to say he wasn't my father, that he didn't need to follow me like a shadow. But as I started to speak, he took a step forward. He stood close, closer than he ever had before. And it was there, between that step and that silence, that something between us changed. His gaze wasn't harsh. It was human. It was the look of someone trained not to feel, but feeling. And I, for the first time, didn't have the strength to pretend I didn't notice. My heart raced, not from fear, but from something I didn't yet know how to name. I stood there facing him, unsure what to do with what hung between us. A silence heavier than words. A boundary that hadn't yet been crossed, but was unraveling. In the end, he stepped back, returned to his firm tone. His role as protector said I should go back, and I did, but I didn't sleep that night. Because as my eyes stared at the dark ceiling of my room, one certainty pierced my chest. He had seen me, truly, and I had seen him too. After that night, everything that had once been subtle gained weight. The way he positioned himself in rooms, always near, but never too close. The way his eyes turned to me a second before any strange sound. The time he spent silent, as if every word he didn't say was an extra measure of care. There were no drastic changes. He didn't treat me differently. He didn't cross the line duty imposed, but something in the air between us grew denser. I felt it. I felt it when our hands nearly touched while passing a key, when he stood from his chair the moment I entered a room, when he looked away faster than necessary. And above all, I felt it when we were alone. We were no longer the same. And it was in that space between what we felt and what we still hadn't said that I began to know him. Little by little, he let pieces of himself slip. Short sentences, brief stories, nothing grand. Just enough to show me there was a man there, not just a silent soldier. I learned he had lost someone, that his pain was old, that the quiet surrounding him wasn't coldness, but armor. And the hardest part of all, I realized he avoided looking at me too long, not out of disinterest, but out of fear of what he might see. And that's when I understood. His silence wasn't distance, it was restraint, because he already felt, just as I felt. And at this point in the story, amid church duties, the community's gazes and my father's sermons, what began to suffocate me wasn't the threat outside, but the certainty that if we continued like this, soon there would be no way to hide it. The problem is that love, when born of care, doesn't explode. It matures in silence. And when it blooms, no one can pretend not to see. It started slowly, as everything between us did. Small shifts in the rhythm of the day. The way I passed him in the hallway and lingered half a second longer before looking away. The way he left my tea ready before I asked, with the lemon just how I liked it, as if he'd noticed my habits when I thought he wasn't looking. And then came the silences. Long silences that weren't uncomfortable. They were charged. He didn't need to say he cared. I felt it. In the way he discreetly followed me when I went out, even during hours he wasn't on duty. In the way he positioned himself between me and any intrusive gaze. In the steady look he gave men who spoke to me for too long. It was affection disguised as duty. And I received that affection like someone learning a new language, slowly, with fear, but enchanted. But the world isn't blind, and the church's eyes are always the first to judge what they don't understand. The whispers began, soft comments after services, sideways glances from older sisters, and the most painful of all, my father's gaze, growing more restless when he saw how I fell silent near him. There were no accusations yet, but there was something in the subtext, in the disguised invitations to keep my distance, in the sudden requests for him to be reassigned for a while, in the questions masked as concern. "Are you okay, daughter?" my father asked one night. And I was. I was more alive than ever, in my life. But how could I say that without confessing a feeling I didn't yet know how to name? Because he never touched me, never said he loved me, and still, my heart no longer obeyed me. Because true love doesn't need declarations. It announces itself in the body, in absence, in waiting. And I waited. Waited for a gesture from him. Waited for him to do what I couldn't, say he felt it. But he stayed silent, more than before. As if he knew that one wrong step could break not only his honor, but shatter my world in two. And as much as it hurt, I understood. He was my guardian. But the one guarding his heart was me. I knew I had crossed an invisible line the moment I entered the room and saw my father standing, hands trembling, holding a letter I hadn't written, but that contained truths I never had the courage to voice. I don't know who wrote it, but someone from some pew in that church decided it was time to intervene, to expose what everyone was already whispering, that there was something too wrong, too close, too intimate between me and the man who swore to protect me. The words didn't come with direct accusations. They were cloaked in concern, in zeal, in the good of your reputation, daughter. But what hurt wasn't the content. It was the fear in my father's eyes. It was his silence, harsher than any shout. And it was that silence that forced me to confess. Not about touches, because there were none. Not about words of love, because none were spoken. But I confessed that I felt that there was something in him that made me breathe differently, that I felt safe, not as someone protected, but as a woman, and that I had found in that silent man a presence more honest than all the appearances I'd been taught to maintain. My father lowered his eyes. There was no scandal. There was only disappointment, and that was worse. He asked me to withdraw for a time. Said the guardian would be dismissed until things calmed down. They didn't let me see him. Didn't let me say goodbye. They just isolated me, as if the feeling could be erased with silence, as if absence could undo everything built in glances, gestures, and souls. The days that followed were gray. I returned to smiling for the church, to singing in the choir, to pretending. But inside, something had died, and it wasn't faith. It was the idea that I could love freely, without the world demanding apologies for it. And every night, lying in the bed where he once swore to protect me, I wondered if he still thought of me. If somewhere in the world, his silence was now pain. Because here, in my chest, it was absence. And absence, when you love, hurts like a farewell. The days passed, and with them, the illusion that everything would return to normal. The prayers continued. The meetings, the services, the visits to community families. I was present everywhere I was expected to be. I fulfilled every role with near mechanical precision. But inside, something no longer responded to the script. I missed him in the most mundane details, in the way he always walked half a step behind me, but attentive to every breath, in his silence beside me, which I now missed as if it had been a voice. And there was the void, the kind of absence not measured in distance, but in lack of meaning. I tried to forget him. I prayed to forget. I begged, in silent tears, for God to help me erase what the world deemed a mistake. But what had grown inside me wasn't a mistake. It was love, and true love doesn't fade with time like a fever. It doesn't yield to distance. It ferments. It grows in the dark, like a root. I began to seek refuge in the places where we used to exchange glances. The bench under the tree behind the church. The room where he used to stand silently, just watching. It was as if, in those spaces, a part of him lingered, not physically, but in the memory of what was lived, even without being touched. And the pain was this: there was never a kiss, an explicit gesture, a promise. Yet he had marked me irreversibly. And maybe that's why the feeling hurt so much, because it was whole, even without being lived. One day, I found an envelope among the books in the church office. I recognized his handwriting before even opening it. No name, no greeting, just a few lines. I broke rules. I didn't touch you, but I loved you like someone guarding something sacred. Even from afar, I keep protecting. I read that sentence. So many times it etched itself into me. And in that moment I realized he hadn't left me. He had only stepped back to avoid destroying me with the choice the world demanded. But me, I could no longer pretend. Because his love, restrained, respectful, invisible, was the only truth still holding me up. It was when the threat returned that everything stopped being theoretical. What had once been a vague discomfort, a letter left, a presence noticed, from a distance, was now real. A strange man was seen lurking around the church. The same name already known to local police surfaced again in anonymous reports. And this time, there was no room for doubt. Someone was watching me with intent. My father tried to stay in control, but it was clear fear consumed him, and I, silently, thought only of him. Not my father, him. The man who, even when sent away, still made me feel protected, and it was on the third day of tension that he reappeared. Unannounced, unrequested, he just appeared. Tall, steady, standing at the church door as if he had never left. My heart tightened before my feet could react. There was no embrace, no smile, just that look. The same look as before, the one that saw me, that read me, and that, now, could no longer hide. He spoke to my father first, offered himself this time without pay, said only that he couldn't stay away, knowing something could happen to me, not because of a contract, because of me. My father hesitated, but fear outweighed pride, and he allowed it. For the days that followed, he accompanied me again. But something was different. The distance he kept had lessened. The way he watched me was more open, as if after all we had lived apart, there was no longer a reason to disguise it. One night, as we closed the church hall, we were alone for a moment. Long, intense, almost unbearable. I faced him, and for the first time, I asked with a steady voice, "Do you love me?" He didn't say yes. He didn't say anything. He just took a step, and in that step, the entire answer came with the weight of everything that had been suppressed. His face was close to mine, but he didn't touch me, and still I trembled. "You know I do," he whispered, and for the first time, I felt time stop. Because in that moment there was no sin, no fear, there was only love, and it was pure, it was whole, it was ours. The following Sunday, when I stepped up to the pulpit to sing, I felt every eye on me, as they always had been. But for the first time I didn't feel trapped by them. My father sat in the front row, as always. He didn't smile, but his eyes weren't harsh. They were tired. And maybe for the first time, open to seeing not just the daughter, but the woman I had become. And he saw, everyone saw. Because I sang with my whole soul, and every word that left my mouth came from a place I had hidden until then. I sang as someone who loves, as someone who was loved in silence, who was cared for without touch, who was protected even from herself, until the love became impossible to hide. And when I finished, I stepped down from the altar and didn't return to the pew where I always sat. I went to him, my guardian, who was there in the back, standing as always, quiet, respectful, ready to protect me from the crowd and not from what I felt. I stood before him with everyone still silent, and without a word I took his hand. Simple as that. No scandal, no confession. Just the truth, finally visible. He hesitated for a moment, but then his fingers closed around mine. And in that restrained touch, there was more love than in any sermon I'd ever heard. After that, the reactions came, some discreet, others indignant. Some whispered, some left before the final blessing. But none of it mattered anymore, because I understood that the faith living in me isn't at odds with the love that grew in me. On the contrary, it strengthens it. And what we live, he and I, wasn't a deviation. It was a miracle, a love that grew in silence, survived absence, overcame guilt, and now walks by my side. And even if the world takes time to understand, we no longer need to hide. She was the pastor's daughter. She grew up amid hymns, gazes, and expectations. He was the man assigned to protect her, trained to stay silent, keep his distance, and vanish when the duty ended. But their love was born in the space between vigilance and care, between the absence of words and the excess of truth. It wasn't quick, it wasn't easy, but it was real, and when the world tried to stifle what was between them with guilt, rules, and fear, they chose the only response true love knows, to stay. Today, he no longer watches from the shadows. He walks by her side, and she, at last, no longer sings, just to please. She sings because she loves. And loving in the end has always been the most sincere prayer.